Welcome to this free talk on Overwhelm, what feeds it and what calms it. I'm Angela, a Walpole integrative therapist at Creative Depths Wellbeing Service. So I help highly sensitive people to break out of overwhelm, to recover from trauma, and find freedom from all sorts of destructive patterns, outdated coping strategies, and addictive tendencies. Doing that through an integration of psychotherapy, creative therapy, and mind-body holistic and somatic work. So overwhelm is such a human experience. It's something that any of us can experience at any point in our lives. And how we respond to that experience really makes all the difference, because there's ways of responding to overwhelm, to stress, to overstimulation in ways that really feed it, exacerbate it, make it much, much worse and perpetuate it, and ways that actually can calm it, soothe it, and get us out of that overwhelmed state as quickly as possible. So I thought I'd offer this talk to help you discover and be reminded of and put into practice some of those really helpful ways that you can respond if you're getting a bit overwhelmed. So how do you know if you're getting overwhelmed? Might sound like an obvious question. And some of the things that you'd normally associate with a state of overwhelm are things like increased heart rate and blood pressure. Heart starts pounding, temperature rises, maybe start to get a bit clammy or a bit sweaty. Your mind maybe starts racing at the time, and then also when it comes to the time when you want to switch off, when you want to go to sleep, it's just still going, your mind's still racing. And maybe your nervous system has become agitated, dysregulated to the point where you're getting a bit shaky, you're getting tremors, maybe the odd heart palpitation, that kind of thing. So those are all the signs of overwhelm that you might normally think of. And they tend to be combined with feelings of panic, anxiety, stress. But there are also other signs of overwhelm as well that you might not necessarily think of. And those are feeling disconnected, feeling numb, feeling just like a bit spaced out, a bit zoned out, isolated from the people you're with, maybe struggling to connect, struggling to think straight, or really even have a coherent thought process at all. And those can be other signs of overwhelm that you might not necessarily associate with that state, but they are. And one way of thinking about these quite contrasting states is that one is hyperarousal, hyperstimulation. That's the racing thoughts, anxiety, heart beating, sweating, feeling stressed, difficulty concentrating. That's hyperstimulation. And the other is hypoarousal, hypostimulation. And that's where you might be feeling numb, a bit dissociated, zoning out. And both are signs that your system, your nervous system, and all the systems within your body mind are freaking out. They've become unstable. And an image that might be helpful when thinking about these different states and becoming more aware of if they're happening for you is the image of the window of tolerance. So you might have come across this before, in which case, great, see this is a bit of a refresher. And if this is your first time, then maybe think of this as a new way of thinking about it. So you've got a window, and when you're inside this window, you feel relatively comfortable, relatively at ease. Your nervous system's pretty stable. You're not feeling like so understimulated that you're kind of bored or a bit distracted, but you're also not so overstimulated that it's overwhelming and it's hard to differentiate between things and between what's important and what's not important. So when you're inside that window of tolerance, it's like being inside your comfort zone. And the size of that window can change. It can change on a day-to-day basis. It can change throughout the day. It can shrink. And as you can imagine, when that zone is small, it's really easy to fall outside of it, and you can fall above it into that state of hyper stimulation, hyperarousal, or even you can fall below it into that state of hypo-stimulation, that kind of zoned out. So that's when your window shrunk, and it could also increase. So your window of tolerance, your comfort zone can grow, and then you feel more and more capable to handle life as it's being thrown at you. And it's harder for you to get overwhelmed. And various factors can shrink or increase the size of that window of tolerance. So factors like, a stressful environment, work stress, family stress, underlying needs not being met, difficult conditions, they can all shrink that window of tolerance. Unprocessed experiences, unprocessed trauma can all shrink it. And what can make it grow is having really supportive conditions. So like a good group of people around you, at home, at work, having the opportunity to work through any unprocessed stuff, any baggage, having certain levels of privilege. If you have certain levels of privilege in your life, they can also, just without you even thinking about it, give you a larger window of tolerance that someone who hasn't had those kind of privileges might have. So some of the other signs of overwhelm are difficulty processing information and remembering things, concentrating. So someone might be talking to you and the words, they're just coming in one ear and out the other. They're just not making sense. It's like your brain just can't differentiate between the types of information that it's taking in. So it all becomes overwhelming. And if you start to get words mixed up or get left and right mixed up, maybe you get more clumsy, they're also all signs that your system, your nervous system, and the rest of your mind and body are getting dysregulated, are getting overwhelmed. Okay, so those are some of the signs, the obvious ones and the less obvious ones of overwhelm. So what feeds overwhelm? What makes it worse? What exacerbates it? So negative self-talk about being overwhelmed. And that's, to give an example of that, is say, maybe I noticed I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. And I go, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. I shouldn't be feeling like this. I should be capable of managing in this situation. Other people seem to be fine. They're not struggling. It's because there's something wrong with me. It's because of this and that and the other. And all this negative self-talk just piles on the criticism. And obviously what that does is just make me feel worse and worse about myself, and also increases any state of overwhelm. Along a similar line is trying to hide it out of shame. So most of the time we go through life, and as adults, we try and present as well as possible to the world. Mostly we try and present as capable and professional and in control and that kind of thing. And it's often seen as a weakness if we can't present like that. But actually, it's really human to sometimes experience overwhelm, to sometimes not be able to cope within a certain situation. But the social conditioning is that there's something wrong with us if that's happening. And so we can feel a lot of shame if we're starting to feel that sense of overwhelm. So a response to that can be to try and mask, to try and hide it, to try and continue to create this persona and show the world that we're okay. But obviously the amount of energy that goes into that and the discrepancy between how we feel on the inside and how we're presenting on the outside creates a huge amount of pressure within us. And that pressure feeds the overwhelm and can really exacerbate the situation, make it much, much worse, and obviously come out in all sorts of things like health problems and difficulty sleeping, and everything really can be exacerbated from that masking and trying to present like we're okay if we're not. Something else that can feed the state of overwhelm is staying in triggering conditions. So there might be certain conditions, certain factors that tend to make you more overwhelmed than other things. So that might be like noise levels, so it might be environmental, so noise levels, particular types of light, busy environments, certain people or certain topics of conversation, certain settings. This is particularly if you've got unresolved trauma and that kind of thing that's just waiting to be activated, lurking in the background, waiting to be activated, like a load of kindling that's just there waiting for the tiniest spark to set it off. So staying in those kind of conditions can continue to trigger your system, your unconscious and your nervous system. And so can ignoring underlying needs. So on a really simple, basic level, if we're tired, if we're not, if you're not sleeping well, if we're not eating well or eating enough, that Snickers advert, you're not yourself when you're hungry, all those kind of really basic, simple things can really quite significantly increase the likelihood of getting overwhelmed and increase any overwhelm that's already there. And trying to ignore those things, like ignoring hunger or sleep or all those kind of things, can exacerbate it. There's also a whole complex range of other needs that we all have as human beings that often aren't really given enough acknowledgement or really honoured. And it's quite common to have at least a few of those needs not being met. And if that happens persistently over time, then that can cause quite a lot of stress and difficulty within the system, within the psyche, and that can come out as getting easily overwhelmed. And then the last thing that can feed overwhelm is caffeine, alcohol, and substance misuse. So obviously, caffeine is a stimulant. So if your nervous system is already a bit frazzled, then caffeine is going to increase that sense of frazzle, may increase the level of overstimulation going on. Alcohol, it's considered quite normal and socially acceptable to have a drink at the end of a difficult day. And some people find that helpful, but obviously if you drink too much, often the next day it can lead to higher anxiety levels and decreased resilience. And then obviously when things like alcohol and other substances get out of hand, then they cause their own problems and issues in and of themselves. So that was what feeds it. What calms it, what can turn that overwhelmed monster into a happy little monster snoozing under a tree, overwhelmed, soothed. So the first step here, which is really, really, really key, even if you never get onto the second step, if you can do the first step, then that will help. That will help. And that is acknowledge it without judgment. So this is the opposite of the negative self-talk and blame and shame that I was talking about in the previous slide. And this looks like you going, oh, okay, like I've recognized some of the symptoms of overwhelm that were in the first slide. Maybe I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed right now. That is a completely human experience. So I go, okay, I'm having a human experience. I'm not infallible. I've got a bit overwhelmed right now. This is where I'm at. And if I really acknowledge that deeply and with compassion, and recognize that it can happen to anybody at any moment, it's not because there's inherently something wrong with me. If I can do that, acknowledge it without judgment, acknowledge it with compassion, then that already begins to soothe my system, my nervous system, and the various systems within me. Already begins to help everything to regulate again. And then the second step is to act, to take some kind of positive action that's going to help. Now, the list of positive actions is really extensive. I'm just going to go through a few here. So the first thing you can do is to start doing some extended exhale breathing. And that is literally breathing out for longer than you breathe in. So that might be breathing into the count of 4 and out to the count of 6 or out to the count of 8. So that would look like breathing in 1, 2, 3, 4, breathing out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, breathing in 1, 2, 3, 4, breathing out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And just doing that for a few breath cycles. You don't have to be, stood in a corner doing that for 10 minutes with people going, what's going on with them? That's something you can do in the very moment that you notice you're starting to get overwhelmed. That's something you can do. A few breath cycles is all it takes to stimulate the vagus nerve. And when the vagus nerve becomes toned and stimulated and activated, it has a tranquilizing, a soothing effect on heart rate and blood pressure. And immediately releases a neurotransmitter which slows down your heart rate, and then your blood pressure starts to drop. And when those two things start to change, physiologically, your body begins to step back to a more regulated, imbalanced state. You can also take a moment to ground, and this could be as simple as just dropping your awareness into the point where your feet touch the floor, and actually notice the real sensations that are happening between your feet and the floor, not what you think the sensations are, not what you think the feeling of the floor and beneath you feels like, but the actual real moment by moment sensations in your feet. And what that also does is get your attention out of your head and onto the feet, down to the ground, which in itself can be quite helpful if your mind is racing away. It also brings you back to the body. So because the body is always present, it's always here, moment by moment, even if the mind tries to zoom off somewhere or float off somewhere, the body is always here. So anything you can do which anchors you in the body, particularly to somewhere like the feet or the palms of the hands, is going to be helpful, going to bring you back into the present moment and out of the overwhelming feelings. If it's possible, remove some of the triggers. So, to give an example of this, I find shopping centres quite easily overwhelming and overstimulating. It's the combination of lots of people, so lots of energies, lots of noise, advertising, lights, all that kind of hustle and bustle, sensorily very overstimulating for me. So I know that if I'm in that kind of environment, from time to time I just check in with myself and I say, how am I doing? And if I notice that I'm starting to get a bit overstimulated, then I'll just go and take a breather. I'll just go and take a couple of minutes out, and then I'll come back. And you can apply the same kind of thing if you're at work, and if you have the opportunity to just go out, literally, even if it's just for a minute, or just make the excuse that you need to use the bathroom, if that's what you have to do to get out of the room for a minute, just leave, take a couple of breaths, come back in. And in a similar vein is meeting any of those underlying basic needs. So as I mentioned before, if you're hungry, get some food. If you're struggling with sleep, do things to help regulate your sleep. I might do another talk at some point about things which can help you sleep better, because I know that's something that people often struggle with. And then if there are other needs that you're aware of that aren't being met, whether they're like social needs or personal needs, that kind of thing, if there's things you can put in place to meet those needs, then that will also help. And if your overwhelm comes from looking at your to-do list, and I'm sure we're all guilty of like having sometimes had a to-do list that's just like really long and it's got things on it that never get done, and every time you look at it you feel like, oh god, there's all this shit to do and how am I going to get through it all? If your overwhelm is sparked by your to-do list, then something that you can do is to prioritize the tasks on it and then schedule those tasks in. So then they don't have to take up thinking time or headspace outside when you're actually doing them, because you can just know that, oh yeah, well, I don't need to think about that thing right now because at 2 o'clock on Wednesday I'm going to be doing it. So I think that's a really simple way of just stopping the to-do list from being so overwhelming. It's just like prioritize the tasks and then schedule them in so you know exactly when they're going to get done. Right, so that is it. What calms overwhelm? Step 1, the most important step: acknowledge it without judgment. You're human, you've got a bit overwhelmed. That is completely normal, and just feeling a bit of kindness, a bit of compassion and acceptance of that state. And then if you're able, move into that second step of taking some very simple, quick action to help your nervous system rebalance and to help you come back inside that window of tolerance, back inside your comfort zone. And these are some more general ways of how to get less overwhelmed in your day-to-day outside of the moment itself. So something I want to advocate is micro mindful pauses throughout your day. So what a micro mindful pause is a moment where you stop and then you restart again. So what that could look like is you've just finished doing something, and before you rush into the next thing, you just breathe in, breathe out, and then you go into the next thing. So you do not need to have a lot or even a bit of time in your day to do these, because they are as short as one single breath cycle. But what I find is adding these in to even quite a busy day creates a feeling of spaciousness. I don't feel then like I've just run from one thing to the other, because I've had these tiny little moments of stopping, tiny little one breathe in, breathe out, carry on. Give yourself permission to not always be busy. So one of the downsides of the influence of consumerism is the emphasis on productivity and productivity equating value, which has led to, in a lot of people, this sense that if you're not being busy and you're not being productive, that you're somehow not worth something in that moment. And a lot of people actually feel guilty when they take a bit of time out, or they say to themselves, oh, I'm being lazy, and they attach all these critical thoughts about themselves to that time because of that conditioning around being busy and productive equals worth, equals value. And actually, if you can begin to unpick that conditioning a little bit, well, this is really an invitation to give yourself permission to not always be busy, to give your system and your being the opportunity to be in being mode rather than constantly in doing mode. And similarly, to let yourself have quality downtime. So if you find it hard to give yourself permission to not always be busy, if you find that difficult, you might also find that when you do have a bit of time free, you want to cram it with as many things as possible, and the to-do list comes out and all these other things. And, you know, in some ways, maybe that's making good use of time free. But I think also, just as human beings, to stay healthy, we do need also to have quality downtime, like time which is genuinely restorative. So whether you find that from doing a yoga nidra, or sitting and reading a book, or sitting and listening to music, doing something creative, whether you find it out on a walk or sitting fishing, I think those times of real quality restorative downtime are really, really essential, and they give our nervous system the opportunity to settle into a different mode of being, into the rest and digest state rather than the act and do state, which we live in quite a lot. And last thing is predict and plan accordingly. So if you are going into a scenario where you know you're quite likely to get overwhelmed, and you've identified the various factors that will make it or easier for you to become overwhelmed, then you can actually plan so that you go into that situation with the most support possible. Whether that means taking in various activities or planning breaks around it, making sure you talk to someone that you have a good relationship with that day maybe, or doing what you can so that after the situation is over, you can then have some time out, or you can do something completely different that is really meaningful and nurturing for yourself. All these things can really help, and all it takes is a bit of thinking ahead, really. So instead of spending all that time that you might spend going, oh God, this thing's coming up, this meeting or this event or whatever is coming up, and it's going to be so overwhelming, and just going over and over that thought cycle. Actually, if you think, okay, well, maybe the chances of me getting overwhelmed or overstimulated in that situation are quite high. But what are some of the things that could help me do it? And just plan so that you can be as resourced and as supported as possible. And my final point is that if you find yourself very easily overwhelmed as a tendency, or you find yourself frequently getting overwhelmed, then it could be that you have unprocessed and unresolved stuff, issues, experiences that are lurking in the background within your body, mind, within your psyche. And they're eating away at your capacity. They're shrinking that window of tolerance, shrinking that comfort zone, and making it easier for you to get overwhelmed. And if that's the case, then seeking out professional help, going to a therapist, someone you really connect with and find a good resonance with, can really, really help you to work through those issues, and therefore free up that internal capacity, expand that window of tolerance again. And if you are experiencing quite a lot of overwhelm because you're going through a really transitional time in your life, whether that's due to big events or big hormonal changes, then there can be specific therapies that can really help with that as well. So Body Talks, one of the therapists that I do, that's really fantastic for supporting through those times of big hormonal changes and really helping your body mind come back into balance throughout that. And then obviously there's other forms of counselling and psychotherapy that I offer and that other people offer that can help you to make it through that time in the best way that you can, and not just end up piling up new unresolved issues onto the pile and shrink that resilience. But with like professional help, you can actually build that resilience and work through the things that need to be worked through. So if you've got any questions about that, about anything I've talked about today, then please get in touch. You can drop me a message through the Facebook group, or you can email me at angela@creativedepths.co.uk. All right, thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.